In the opening months of 1942, the Pacific War was a nightmare for Allied forces. Japanese fighters dominated the skies with a fearsome reputation, faster, more maneuverable, and flown by some of the most experienced combat pilots in the world. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 seemed virtually unbeatable, cutting through American fighters like a samurai sword through silk. But by 1943, something had changed. A twin-boomed American fighter was hunting Japanese aircraft across the vast Pacific with devastating effectiveness. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was destroying more Japanese aircraft than any other Allied fighter. The question wasn't just what the P-38 could do, it was how American pilots learned to use it. This is the story of the tactical revolution that turned the tables in the Pacific War. When the Zero entered service in 1940, it represented a quantum leap in fighter design. Designer Jiro Horikoshi had created something extraordinary, a fighter combining excellent maneuverability, high airspeed, strong firepower, and very long range. To Allied pilots encountering it for the first time, the Zero seemed impossible. American test pilots found that the Zero's controls were very light at 200 mebalessons but stiffened at speeds above 216. At slow speeds, where dogfights typically occurred, the Zero could complete a turn in just over 6 seconds, with a turn radius of 629 feet at slower speeds. This extraordinary maneuverability came from ruthless weight reduction, no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, just pure performance. The Zero's lightweight construction made it lethal in a turning fight. While the P-38 could not outturn the A6M-0 and most other Japanese fighters when flying below 200 mph, its superior speed coupled with a good rate of climb meant that it could use energy tactics, making multiple high-speed passes at its target. But in early 1942, nobody had figured that out yet. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was unlike anything that had come before. First conceived in 1937 by Lockheed Chief Engineer Hall L. Hibbard and his then assistant Clarence Kelly Johnson, the twin-boomed P-38 was the most innovative plane of its day, combining speed with unheard-of advances, 2 supercharged engines and a potent mix of 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. The design was radical, twin engines in elongated booms, with the pilot and weapons in a central nacelle. Johnson and his team conceived this twin-engine, single-pilot fighter airplane in 1936, and the Army Air Corps authorized the firm to build it in June 1937. Lockheed finished constructing the prototype XP-38 and delivered it to the Air Corps on New Year's Day 1939. The P-38 was the first American fighter to make extensive use of stainless steel and smooth, flush-riveted, butt-jointed aluminum skin panels. It was also the first military airplane to fly, faster than 400 mph in level flight. On paper, the P-38 was formidable. In practice, it initially struggled. Early on in the war in North Africa, the P-38 gained a poor reputation as a dogfighter and was seen by German pilots as an easy kill. A major reason is that early P-38 pilots were utilizing conventional turning dogfight tactics. Instead of using its faster speed and higher altitude to make single diving passes, then speed away from harm before turning to make another lightning pass. The same mistake was being made in the Pacific. Pilots trained in traditional dogfighting were trying to turn with the nimble Zero, a fatal error. The P-38 weighed nearly twice as much as a Zero. In a turning fight below 200 mph, it was outmatched. Something had to change, and it did. The breakthrough came from understanding a fundamental principle. Don't fight your enemy's fight, force them to fight yours. The P-38's advantages were clear: superior speed, excellent climb rate, twin-engine reliability over vast ocean distances, and devastating concentrated firepower. Not as maneuverable as the Japanese fighters, the Lockheed P-38 Lightnings used dive and zoom tactics and their formidable centerline firepower of 4 50-inch machine guns and a single 20mm cannon to gain victories. This was the trick: boom and zoom. Instead of engaging in turning dogfights, P-38 pilots learned to use altitude as a weapon. They would climb high above Japanese formations, dive at tremendous speed. The P-38 could reach over 400 mph, fire a devastating burst from their nose-mounted weapons, and then zoom back up to altitude before the Zeros could respond. American pilots exploited its strengths, using boom and zoom tactics to dive, fire, and climb out of reach, denying the Japanese their preferred close-range combat. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese aviators spoke of constant tension, knowing a P-38 could strike anywhere. Its ruggedness frustrated opponents who watched damaged Lightnings escape and return to fight again. This eroded the confidence that had defined Japan's early war air dominance. One P-38 pilot from the Pacific Theater described the revelation. It was very fast and had good firepower. That gave a lot of people false confidence when they first went to P-38s. Their limitations on tactics were the same as those we were accustomed to in the P-40s, but even more so. You did not go looking for a close-in dogfight with an Oscar or Zero. Japanese planes were quicker at slow speed, but new pilots did not always realize the consequences. If the speed bled off a P-38, which happened very easily, it could be in serious trouble against a Japanese fighter. Many of our men found out the hard way, particularly when we first started receiving the P-38s. The lesson was brutal but clear. Maintain speed, maintain altitude, and never ever get drawn into a slow-speed turning contest. Two men would become the embodiment of this new tactical doctrine: Major Richard Dick Bong and Major Thomas Tommy McGuire. The late great Major Richard Ira Dick Bong, America's ace of aces, scored all 40 of his aerial kills against Imperial Japanese aircraft in a Lightning. America's second-place ace, Major Thomas B. Mickey McGuire Jr., also scored all of his victories, 38 of them, in a P-38. Dick Bong was a farm boy from Wisconsin who understood the P-38's capabilities intuitively. Bong considered his gunnery accuracy to be poor, so he compensated by getting as close to his targets as possible to make sure he hit them. What Bong lacked in marksmanship, he made up for in patience and tactical discipline. He would position his P-38 perfectly, strike with overwhelming firepower, and disappear before the enemy could react. In his first action, Bong reportedly was separated from the rest of the formation and found himself surrounded by several Japanese planes. He promptly shot 2 down and escaped unscathed. When General George C. Kenney received his orders to report to Australia to assume command of air units in the Southwest Pacific area of operations, he asked General Henry H. Arnold for P-38s to replace the older designs. Kenney also asked for a particularly aggressive young lieutenant named Richard Ira Bong, who he had called on the carpet for unauthorized low-altitude aerobatics in a P-38, including looping the loop around the Golden Gate Bridge. Bong would later become the US ace of aces with 40 confirmed kills in a P-38. The Japanese began calling the P-38 2 planes, 1 pilot, an acknowledgement of its twin-engine profile and fearsome reputation. The Germans, who had earlier dismissed it, now dubbed it der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. The P-38's capabilities would be tested in one of the most audacious missions of the Pacific War. The target, Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet. On April 14, 1943, US radio interception sites copied a Japanese message and sent it to the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific at Pearl Harbor, where cryptologists worked for hours to decipher the message and determine its relevance. Through careful analysis, they found the transmission to be a detailed accounting of the Japanese naval chief's inspection tour. The message contained precise details: times, locations, the exact route Yamamoto would fly. President Franklin Roosevelt's response was reportedly simple: get Yamamoto. There was only one problem. The intercept point was over 400 miles from the nearest Allied airfield, far beyond the range of most fighters. The only fighters capable of that range were the US Army Air Force's P-38 Lightnings. This twin-boom fighter was known for its ability to climb and packed a powerful punch with 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. 18 P-38s, 16 for the attack, 2 spares, were selected and equipped with special drop tanks. A killer flight of 4 fighters led by Captain Thomas G. Lanphier Jr. would attack the 2 Betty bombers containing Yamamoto and his staff, while the others attacked the fighter escorts. On the morning of April 18, 1943, the P-38s took off from Guadalcanal. It was Palm Sunday. It was an uneventful flight, but a hot one, at from 10 to 50 feet above the water all the way. Some of the pilots counted sharks. One counted pieces of driftwood. Major John Mitchell led the formation on a complex 5-leg route, navigating by compass, airspeed, and his wristwatch alone. In a remarkable feat of dead reckoning, the Americans arrived at 9:34, a minute early. At 9:34, they spotted Yamamoto's formation, 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The P-38s climbed from their low-altitude approach and struck. First Lieutenant Rex T. Barber opened fire on the first Betty, hitting the right engine which caused heavy smoking, and the aircraft crashed into the jungle. This was the plane with Admiral Yamamoto on board. The escort mission lasted only minutes. 1 P-38 was lost, but both Betty bombers were destroyed. Japanese forces did not reach the jungle crash site until the following day, where they found Yamamoto's white-gloved hand still clutching his sword. He had been killed by 1, perhaps 2, of Barber's 50 caliber bullets, and not from the crash. The Japanese did not announce Yamamoto's death until May 21, 1943. After intercepting the Admiral and his escort of Zero fighters, Japanese naval morale was crushed, and Allied morale soared. The intercept helped set the stage for an Allied victory in the Pacific. Operation Vengeance demonstrated what the P-38 could achieve when properly employed. By mid-1943, the tactical revolution was complete. The Lightning was ideally suited for the Pacific theatre. It possessed a performance markedly superior to that of its Japanese opponents. It possessed a range significantly better than that of the P-39s, P-40s and P-47s available in 1942 in the Southwest Pacific, and its twin engines offered an additional safety factor when operating over long stretches of water and jungle. The Lightnings proved to be extremely rugged and could take a lot of battle damage and still keep flying. Missions lasting 9, 10 or even 12 hours became routine, and many wounded Lightnings were able to limp home on only one engine. Saburo Sakai, the famed Japanese fighter ace, regarded P-38 highly, noting after the war that P-38 fighters destroyed the morale of the Zero fighter pilot. Early dismissals turned to alarm when P-38s began chasing Zeros from impossible distances and escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. By late 1943, Japanese forces faced a new reality. P-38s could strike anywhere, any time, with overwhelming firepower and disappear before effective response. The numbers tell the story. Lightning pilots in the Pacific Theatre downed more Japanese aircraft than pilots flying any other Army Air Forces warplane. By the war's end, no fewer than 38 other pilots from the 475th had achieved ace status while flying exclusively P-38s. By that time, the shortage of P-38s had been alleviated somewhat, and there were 5 fighter groups fully equipped with P-38s, the 8th, 8th, 49th, 347th and 475th. The 475th was perhaps the best known of these, since it contained among its personnel the top 3 scoring aces in the Pacific: Richard the Bong, 40 kills, Thomas B. McGuire, Jr., 38 kills, and C.H. MacDonald, 27 kills. The P-38's success wasn't just about raw performance. It was about understanding how to use that performance. The late-model P-38J, with its powered ailerons, its dive brakes, and its combat flaps, could, if flown properly by an experienced pilot, actually hold its own against a nimble Zero in a dogfight at low and medium altitudes. However, it was generally a good idea to follow the advice of experienced combat veterans and avoid such dogfights against the Zero. The Pacific War became a proving ground for this new philosophy of aerial combat. While the Zero remained formidable in the hands of skilled pilots, the P-38 pilots who mastered boom and zoom tactics essentially neutralized the Zero's advantages. Combat rarely occurred above 6,000 Yetawal to 20,000 FT, and the engine and cockpit comfort problems common in Europe never plagued pilots in the Pacific theatre. The Lightning's excellent range was used to full advantage above the vast expanses of water. The missions became legendary. In early 1945, Lightning pilots of the 12th Fighter Squadron, 18th Fighter Group, flew a mission that lasted 10-1-2 hours and covered more than 3,220 kilometers, 2,000 miles. In August, P-38 pilots established the world's long-distance record for a World War II combat fighter when they flew from the Philippines to the Netherlands East Indies, a distance of 3,703 ki, to 300 miles. The tactical doctrine that emerged from the Pacific would influence fighter tactics for decades. Energy fighting, using speed and altitude advantage rather than trying to outturn an opponent, became the foundation of modern air combat tactics. The lessons learned by P-38 pilots over the jungles of New Guinea and the waters of the Solomon Islands would be studied by fighter pilots flying F-86 Sabres in Korea, F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam, and F-15 Eagles in the Middle East. Richard Bong's story encapsulates this transformation. Bong's ability as a fighter pilot was recognized while he was training in Northern California. He was commissioned a second lieutenant and awarded his pilot wings on January 19, 1942. His first assignment was as an instructor, gunnery pilot at Luke Field, Arizona, from January to May 1942. On June 12, 1942, Bong flew very low, buzzed, over a house in nearby San Anselmo, the home of a pilot who had just been married. He was cited and temporarily grounded for breaking flying rules, along with 3 other P-38 pilots who had looped around the Golden Gate Bridge on the same day. For looping the Golden Gate Bridge, flying at a low-level down Market Street in San Francisco, and blowing the clothes off of an Oakland woman's clothesline, Bong was reprimanded by General George C. Kenney. But Kenney saw something in the young pilot. In November, while the squadron waited for delivery of the scarce P-38s, Bong and other 9th FS pilots were reassigned temporarily to fly missions and gain combat experience with the 39th Fighter Squadron, 35th Fighter Group based in Port Moresby, New Guinea. On December 27, Bong claimed his initial aerial victory, shooting down a Mitsubishi A6M-0 and a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar over Buna during the Battle of Bunagona. For this action, Bong was awarded the Silver Star. In July, Bong claimed 4 Japanese fighters over Leh in an action that earned him the Distinguished Service Cross. What made Bong exceptional wasn't just his flying skill, it was his understanding of how to fight with the P-38. In some cases he flew through the debris of exploding enemy aircraft and on one occasion collided with his target, which he claimed as a probable victory. After visiting training bases and going on a 15-state bond promotion tour, Bong returned to New Guinea in September. He was assigned to the V-Fighter Command Staff as an advanced gunnery instructor, with permission to go on missions but not to seek combat. Bong continued flying from Tacloban Leyte during the Philippines campaign. By December 17th, he had increased his air-to-air victory claims to 40. On the recommendation of General Kenney, the Far East Air Force commander, Bong received the Medal of Honor from General Douglas MacArthur in a special ceremony in December 1944. The competition between Bong and Tommy McGuire became the stuff of legend. Both men exemplified the new tactical approach, but their personalities differed dramatically. Where Bong was methodical and patient, McGuire was aggressive and competitive. During early 1944, Lightning pilots in the 475th Fighter Group began the Race of Aces. By March, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas J. Lynch had scored 21 victories before he fell to anti-aircraft gunfire while strafing enemy ships. Major Thomas B. McGuire downed 38 Japanese aircraft before he was killed when his P-38 crashed at low altitude in early January 1945. McGuire's death came as a reminder that even the best tactics couldn't eliminate all risks. In January 1945, with 38 victories to his name and closing in on Bong's record, McGuire made a fatal mistake. During a low-altitude engagement, he violated the cardinal rule of P-38 tactics. He allowed his speed to bleed off in a turning fight. His Lightning stalled and crashed, killing him instantly. It was a stark reminder that the tactical revolution that had made the P-38 so effective required discipline. The temptation to engage in a dogfight, especially when victory seemed close, could be fatal. The boom and zoom doctrine wasn't just about maximizing the P-38's strengths, it was about survival. By 1944, the tactical superiority of properly flown P-38s was undeniable. Japanese pilots, who had entered the war with superior training and combat experience, now faced American pilots who had not only caught up, but developed tactics specifically designed to negate Japanese advantages. The transformation was psychological as much as tactical. Early in the war, American pilots had approached combat with the Zero with trepidation, knowing they were outmatched in maneuverability. By 1944, P-38 pilots hunted Japanese fighters with confidence, understanding that their tactics gave them the advantage. This confidence was built on bitter experience. The first P-38Fs to reach Australia during 1942 were assigned to the 39th Fighter Squadron of the 35th Fighter Group. This unit traded in its Bell-era Cobras for the Lightnings at Amberley in Queensland, before returning to combat operations at Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. Its first success took place on December 27, 1942, when its pilots claimed 11 kills for the loss of only one P-38F. That 11-to-1 kill ratio on the P-38's first major engagement was no accident. It was the result of pilots beginning to understand how to properly employ their aircraft. The technical evolution of the P-38 paralleled the tactical evolution of its pilots. Early models had limitations that became apparent in combat. The controls were heavy, especially at high speeds. The aircraft suffered from compressibility issues in high-speed dives. The nose would tuck under, and the aircraft would become difficult to control. During late spring 1941, Air Corps Major Signe A. Gilke encountered serious trouble while diving his Lightning at high speed from an altitude of 9,120 meters, 30,000 ft. When he reached an indicated airspeed of about 515 kph, 320 pen, the airplane's tail began to shake violently, and the nose dropped until the dive was almost vertical. Engineers worked to solve these problems. Late in 1943, a few hundred dive flap field modification kits were assembled to give North African, European and Pacific P-38s a chance to withstand compressibility and expand their combat tactics. By the time the P-38J entered service, many of these issues had been addressed. The flaps were finally incorporated into the production line in June 1944 on the last 210 P-38Js. But the most important improvements weren't mechanical, they were doctrinal. The understanding of how to fight with the P-38 made far more difference than any technical modification. The concentrated firepower of the P-38 was another crucial advantage that pilots learned to exploit. Unlike most fighters of the era, which mounted their guns in the wings, the P-38's 4 50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon were all mounted in the nose. This meant that all the bullets converged at a single point, creating a devastating cone of fire. Wing-mounted guns, by contrast, were harmonized to converge at a specific distance, typically 250 to 300 yards. Inside or outside that range, the bullets spread apart, reducing effectiveness. The P-38 had no such limitation. At any range, all its weapons fired at the same point. This made Bong's close-range tactics particularly effective. While he compensated for poor marksmanship by getting close to his targets, the P-38's nose-mounted armament meant that when he did hit, he hit hard. The concentrated firepower could shred an enemy aircraft in seconds. Japanese aircraft, with their lightweight construction and lack of armor, were particularly vulnerable. A short burst from a P-38's guns could cause catastrophic damage. The Zero's fuel tanks, unprotected by self-sealing materials, would ignite if punctured. The thin aluminum skin offered no protection against .50 caliber rounds. The P-38's twin-engine configuration, initially viewed with skepticism by some pilots, proved invaluable over the vast expanses of the Pacific. Single-engine fighters had to turn back if they experienced the engine trouble over water. P-38 pilots could limp home on one engine, a capability that saved countless lives. This reliability was both practical and psychological. Pilots flying single-engine fighters over hundreds of miles of ocean knew that a single mechanical failure meant a bailout and probable death. P-38 pilots had the confidence that came from knowing they had a backup. This confidence translated into more aggressive tactics and deeper penetration into enemy territory. The range advantage was enormous. A consignment of 165 and 310 US gallon drop tanks were flown out especially for the operation. This referred to Operation Vengeance, but it illustrated the P-38's capabilities. With drop tanks, the Lightning could fly missions that were simply impossible for other fighters. This range allowed P-38s to escort bombers all the way to their targets and back, something that would have profound implications not just in the Pacific but also in Europe. The ability to provide fighter escort for the entire duration of a bombing mission changed the strategic bombing campaign. The human element of this tactical revolution cannot be overstated. The transformation from conventional dogfighting to boom and zoom tactics required pilots to overcome deeply ingrained instincts. Fighter pilots were trained to turn with their opponents, to get on their tail and stay there. Breaking off an engagement, zooming away to altitude felt like running away. It took discipline and trust in the doctrine to resist the temptation to turn with a more maneuverable opponent. Some pilots never learned this lesson. They continued trying to dogfight Zeros and paid the price. Others, like Bong and McGuire, mastered the new tactics and became legendary. The training evolved to reflect these lessons. New P-38 pilots arriving in the Pacific were taught from the start. Use your speed, use your altitude, never get slow in a turning fight. The institutional knowledge that developed saved countless lives and destroyed countless Japanese aircraft. General Kenny's role in this transformation was crucial. As commander of the 5th Air Force, he understood that the P-38 required different tactics than conventional fighters. He encouraged experimentation, protected pilots like Bong who showed innovative thinking, and spread successful tactics throughout his command. The impact on Japanese air operations was severe. The Zero had given Japanese forces air superiority in the early months of the war. This superiority allowed Japanese bombers to operate with relative impunity, and Japanese ground forces to advance without fear of air attack. The arrival of properly employed P-38s changed everything. Japanese bombers now needed heavy fighter escort. Japanese fighters, once confident in their superiority, now had to worry about P-38s diving from above with devastating speed and firepower. The psychological impact of the P-38's boom and zoom tactics was particularly significant. Japanese pilots never knew when a P-38 might appear above them, dive through their formation, destroy one or two aircraft, and disappear before they could respond. This created constant stress and eroded the confidence that had characterized Japanese air operations in 1942. The attrition of experienced Japanese pilots compounded the problem. Japan's pilot training program, excellent at the war's start, couldn't keep pace with losses. As experienced pilots were shot down, they were replaced with less experienced ones who were even more vulnerable to P-38 tactics. By late 1944, American air superiority in the Pacific was absolute. This superiority was built on many factors: industrial production, pilot training, aircraft performance, but the tactical innovation of boom and zoom fighting with the P-38 was a crucial element. The P-38's success in the Pacific stands in interesting contrast to its performance in Europe. In the European theatre, the P-38 initially struggled. The extreme cold at high altitude caused mechanical problems. German fighters, particularly the Fokker-Wulf, FEW-190, and later variants of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 were formidable opponents. But here too, tactical doctrine made the difference. When P-38 pilots in Europe adopted boom and zoom tactics similar to those developed in the Pacific, their success rate improved dramatically. The fundamental principle was the same: use speed and altitude to dictate the terms of engagement. By late 1944, however, the P-51 Mustang was replacing the P-38 in most European fighter groups. The Mustang had better high-altitude performance and was less expensive to produce. But in the Pacific, the P-38 remained the preferred Army Air Force's fighter through the end of the war. The reasons were partly practical. The twin-engine reliability was more important over water than over Europe, and partly doctrinal. Pacific-based pilots and commanders had developed such expertise with P-38 tactics that switching to a new aircraft type made little sense. The story of the P-38 in the Pacific is ultimately a story about adaptation and innovation. The aircraft itself was remarkable, but the tactical revolution that made it so effective was entirely human. Pilots and commanders had to overcome preconceptions, learn from bitter experience, and develop entirely new ways of fighting. The transition from traditional dogfighting to energy tactics represented a fundamental shift in aerial combat philosophy. Instead of trying to outmaneuver opponents, P-38 pilots learned to outthink them. Instead of accepting the enemy's terms of engagement, they imposed their own. This shift required courage of a different kind. It's one thing to be brave in a turning dogfight, where you can see your opponent and match maneuver for maneuver. It's another thing entirely to have the discipline to break off an engagement when every instinct screams at you to continue, to zoom away and climb back to altitude while your opponent is right there, to trust that the tactical doctrine is correct even when it feels wrong. The pilots who mastered these tactics became the most successful American fighter aces of the war. Dick Bong's 40 victories and Tommy McGuire's 38 weren't just products of skill and courage, they were products of understanding how to fight effectively with the P-38. The legacy of the P-38's tactical revolution extends far beyond World War II. The energy fighting doctrine developed by P-38 pilots in the Pacific became the foundation of modern fighter tactics. The concepts of boom and zoom fighting, of using speed and altitude to control an engagement, of refusing to fight on the enemy's terms, these principles are taught to fighter pilots to this day. Modern aerial combat, with its beyond visual range missiles and advanced avionics, looks very different from the gunfights over New Guinea in 1943, but the underlying principles remain the same. Maintain energy, control the engagement, use your advantages, don't fight the enemy's fight. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin booms and concentrated nose armament, became one of the most recognizable aircraft of World War II. But its true significance wasn't just its appearance or performance, it was the tactical revolution it enabled. When the war began, Japanese air forces dominated the Pacific skies with superior equipment, training, and experience. When it ended, American air superiority was absolute. The P-38 Lightning, and the tactics developed for it, played a crucial role in that transformation. The trick that turned Japanese air supremacy upside down wasn't a secret weapon or a technological breakthrough. It was a simple but profound insight. Fight smart, not just hard. Use your advantages. Don't play your opponent's game. This insight, developed through bitter experience and applied with discipline and courage, changed the course of the Pacific War. In the end, the P-38's greatest weapon wasn't its speed or its firepower. It was the tactical doctrine that allowed American pilots to use those capabilities to maximum effect. The boom and zoom tactics developed for the Lightning didn't just defeat Japanese fighters, they revolutionized aerial combat itself. And that revolution began with a simple decision. When fighting the nimble Zero, don't turn with it. Dive on it from above, strike with overwhelming firepower and zoom back to altitude before it can respond. Do it again, and again, and again. That was the P-38 trick that turned Japanese air supremacy upside down, and it won the skies over the Pacific. The contrast between the P-38's early struggles and its later dominance reveals an important truth about warfare. Superior equipment alone doesn't guarantee victory. The P-38 was always capable of the performance that made it so deadly in 1944. The difference was that by then, pilots understood how to use those capabilities. This understanding came at a cost. Many pilots died learning what didn't work. The early P-38 pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros paid for their lessons with their lives. Their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Their experience, hard-won and bitter, became the foundation of the tactical doctrine that would save countless others. The dissemination of these tactics throughout the Army Air Forces was itself remarkable. In modern militaries, lessons learned in combat are systematically collected, analysed, and distributed through formal training programs. In World War II, this process was more ad hoc, but no less effective. Commanders like General Kenny ensured that successful tactics were taught to new pilots. Veteran pilots returning from combat shared their experiences. Squadron intelligence officers compiled after-action reports that detailed what worked and what didn't. Gradually, the institutional knowledge grew. By 1944, a pilot joining a P-38 squadron in the Pacific would be taught boom and zoom tactics from day one. He would learn from pilots who had learned from pilots who had learned from the early pioneers like Bong and McGuire. The tactical doctrine had become standardized, codified, and proven. The technical evolution of American fighters during the war shows how tactics and technology influenced each other. The P-38's success with energy fighting tactics influenced the design of later fighters. The P-51 Mustang, which eventually replaced the P-38 in Europe, was designed from the start with energy fighting in mind. Its laminar flow wing gave it excellent high-speed performance, perfect for boom and zoom tactics. Similarly, the Navy's F-6 of Hellcat, which became the dominant carrier fighter in the Pacific, employed similar tactics against Japanese aircraft. The Hellcat wasn't as fast as the P-38, but it was faster than the Zero, and Hellcat pilots used the same energy fighting principles that P-38 pilots had developed. This cross-pollination of tactical ideas shows how the P-38's lessons spread throughout American air forces. The boom and zoom doctrine wasn't unique to the P-38. It was a fundamental principle that could be applied by any fighter with speed and altitude advantages over its opponents. The Japanese, for their part, struggled to adapt. The Zero's design philosophy, which emphasized maneuverability and range at the expense of speed, armor, and firepower, had been perfect for the war's early months. But as American tactics evolved, the Zero's weaknesses became critical. Japan did develop new fighters to counter American aircraft. The Kawasaki Ki-61 and Nakajima Ki-84 were faster and better armoured than the Zero, but by the time these aircraft entered service in significant numbers, American numerical superiority was overwhelming, and American pilots, with their energy fighting tactics, could largely negate the advantages of even these improved Japanese fighters. The strategic implications of American air superiority in the Pacific were profound. Control of the air meant that American amphibious operations could proceed with minimal interference from Japanese aircraft. American bombers could attack Japanese shipping, cutting off supply lines to isolated garrisons. American reconnaissance aircraft could locate Japanese forces with impunity. The P-38's long range made it particularly valuable for these strategic missions. P-38s could escort bombers on strikes hundreds of miles from their bases. They could fly reconnaissance missions deep into Japanese-held territory. They could patrol vast areas of ocean, protecting American shipping and hunting Japanese convoys. This operational flexibility was something Japanese fighters simply couldn't match. The Zero had impressive range for a fighter of its era, but even it couldn't compete with the P-38's ability to fly 10-hour missions with drop tanks. And Japanese twin-engine fighters, like the Kawasaki Ki-45, lacked the speed and maneuverability to compete with the P-38 in combat. The result was that by 1944, Japanese forces in the Pacific operated under constant threat from the air. Their convoys were attacked, their bases were bombed, their troop concentrations were strafed, and their own aircraft were swept from the skies by American fighters using tactics specifically designed to exploit Japanese weaknesses. Individual pilots' stories illustrate the human dimension of this tactical revolution. Beyond Bong and McGuire, dozens of other P-38 pilots became aces in the Pacific. Each had his own style, his own preferences, but all employed the same basic tactical doctrine. Charles McDonald, who scored 27 victories, became one of the leading aces in the Pacific. J. Robbins, with 22 victories, was another top P-38 pilot. Gerald Johnson scored 22 victories. All flew with the same fighter groups, learned from the same veterans, and employed the same tactics. What's striking is how consistent their approach was. After-action reports from different pilots in different squadrons described the same tactics. Gain altitude, dive on the enemy, fire a short burst, zoom back to altitude. The variations were individual. Some pilots preferred to attack from directly above, others from a slight angle. Some liked to get very close before firing, others opened fire at longer range. But the fundamental approach was universal. This consistency wasn't accidental. It reflected a mature tactical doctrine, developed through experience and refined through practice. It was taught deliberately, practiced systematically, and employed effectively. The training pipeline for P-38 pilots evolved to support this doctrine. New pilots in the United States practiced high-speed dives and zooms. They learned energy management, how to convert altitude into speed and speed back into altitude. They practiced deflection shooting, essential for hitting a target during a high-speed diving pass. By the time a pilot reached a combat squadron in the Pacific, he had the basic skills needed to employ boom and zoom tactics effectively. He still needed combat experience to become truly proficient, but he wasn't starting from scratch. The institutional knowledge built up over years of combat was being passed on systematically. The role of ground crews and maintenance personnel in the P-38's success cannot be overlooked. The Lightning was a complex aircraft with 2 engines, turbochargers, and sophisticated systems. Keeping it flying required skilled mechanics and a reliable supply chain. In the harsh conditions of the Pacific, tropical heat, humidity, dust, and primitive airfields carved out of jungle, this was no small challenge. Ground crews worked around the clock to keep the P-38s flying. They improvised repairs with limited parts. They adapted maintenance procedures to local conditions. They performed miracles of mechanical ingenuity to keep aircraft combat ready. The P-38's twin engines, while providing redundancy and range, also meant twice the maintenance burden. Each engine had its own turbocharger, oil system, and cooling system. All had to work perfectly for the aircraft to perform to its full potential. The ground crew's dedication meant that P-38 squadrons could maintain high sortie rates even in difficult conditions. Aircraft damaged in combat could often be repaired and returned to service within days. The maintenance personnel's skill in keeping complex machines running in primitive conditions was as important to the P-38's success as the pilot's tactical skill. The intelligence war played a crucial role in the P-38's effectiveness. American codebreakers, who had cracked Japanese naval codes, provided advance warning of Japanese movements. This intelligence allowed P-38 squadrons to position themselves advantageously for interceptions. Operation Vengeance, The mission to intercept Admiral Yamamoto was the most dramatic example of this intelligence advantage, but there were countless other instances where code-breaking gave American forces crucial advantages. P-38 squadrons would be alerted to incoming Japanese raids in time to gain altitude and position themselves for effective interceptions. They would be directed to Japanese shipping convoys that would otherwise have passed undetected. This intelligence advantage combined with the P-38's tactical advantages to create a devastating combination. Japanese forces not only faced technically superior American fighters, flown according to effective tactics, they often faced them at times, and places where the Americans had every advantage. The Japanese, for their part, rarely had similar intelligence advantages. Their code-breaking efforts against American forces were less successful. They often didn't know where American forces were or what they were planning. This informational disadvantage compounded their tactical and technical disadvantages. The P-38's distinctive appearance became iconic. The twin booms and central nacelle created a silhouette that was instantly recognizable. American forces called it the Fork-tailed Devil, after hearing that was supposedly the German nickname. Japanese forces called it two planes, one pilot. This distinctive appearance had practical implications. In the confusion of aerial combat, misidentification could be fatal, but the P-38's unique silhouette made it almost impossible to mistake for an enemy aircraft. American pilots could identify P-38s at a glance, reducing the risk of friendly fire incidents. The psychological impact of this distinctive appearance shouldn't be underestimated. Japanese pilots learned to recognize the P-38's silhouette and to fear it. The sight of twin booms in the distance meant danger, likely an attack from above at high speed. This psychological effect, the product of countless successful boom and zoom attacks, gave the P-38 an advantage before the first shot was fired. The Lightning's appearance also made it effective for ground attack missions. Its distinctive silhouette was recognized by friendly ground forces, reducing the risk that they would fire on it, and its concentrated nose armament made it effective for strafing attacks on ground targets. By late 1944, P-38s were being used for a wide variety of missions beyond air-to-air combat. They flew ground attack missions, strafing Japanese positions and supply lines. They flew reconnaissance missions, with cameras mounted in modified nose sections. They flew night fighter missions, with radar equipment allowing them to intercept Japanese bombers in darkness. This versatility was another advantage. A fighter squadron equipped with P-38s could perform almost any mission required. This flexibility was particularly valuable in the fluid conditions of the Pacific War, where missions and priorities could change rapidly. The end of the war brought a close to the P-38's combat career, but its legacy lived on. The tactical lessons learned by P-38 pilots formed the foundation of jet-age fighter tactics. When American pilots flew F-86 Sabres against Soviet-built MiG-15s in Korea, they employed energy fighting tactics, derived directly from P-38 experience in World War II. The boom and zoom doctrine remained relevant because the fundamental physics of aerial combat hadn't changed. Energy, the combination of speed and altitude, remained the key to controlling an engagement. The side that could dictate when and where combat occurred had an enormous advantage. This principle holds true even in modern aerial combat, with beyond visual range missiles and advanced radar. The fighter that can choose whether to engage or disengage, that can strike and escape before the enemy can respond, has a decisive advantage. The F-15 Eagle's motto, "Not a pound for air-to-ground," reflected a design philosophy focused on air superiority through energy advantage, a philosophy that traced its roots back to the P-38 and earlier. The human stories behind the tactical revolution remain compelling decades later. Richard Bong returned to the United States in 1945 as America's greatest fighter ace. He married his longtime sweetheart and was assigned to test pilot duties. Tragically, he was killed on August 6, 1945, when a P-80 jet fighter he was testing crashed shortly after takeoff. It was the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Tommy McGuire's death in combat in January 1945 robbed him of the chance to surpass Bong's record, but his aggressive tactics and competitive spirit had helped define P-38 combat doctrine in the Pacific. Both men received the Medal of Honor for their achievements. The other P-38 aces returned to civilian life, carrying with them the knowledge that they had been part of something significant. They had helped develop tactics that changed the course of the war. They had mastered one of the most challenging fighters of the era, and used it to devastating effect. In reunions and interviews in the decades after the war, these veterans would describe the P-38 with affection and respect. They remembered its quirks, the heavy controls, the counter-rotating propellers that eliminated torque but could catch inexperienced pilots off guard. They remembered its capabilities, the speed, the firepower, the ability to fly home on one engine. Most of all, they remembered the tactics that made it so effective, the discipline of boom and zoom fighting, the patience required to climb back to altitude after each pass, the satisfaction of a successful attack, diving through a Japanese formation, seeing the tracers converge, and zooming back to safety. The P-38 Lightning story is ultimately about more than just aircraft performance or technical specifications. It's about innovation in the face of adversity. It's about learning from mistakes and adapting tactics to exploit advantages. It's about individual courage and institutional learning. When American forces entered the Pacific War, they faced an enemy with superior equipment and more experienced pilots. By the war's end, they had achieved total air superiority. This transformation was built on industrial, production, pilot training, and technical innovation. But it was also built on tactical innovation, on learning to fight smart as well as hard. The P-38's boom and zoom tactics were a crucial part of this transformation. They took an aircraft that initially struggled in combat and turned it into one of the most effective fighters of the war. They neutralized the advantages of Japanese aircraft and exploited their weaknesses. They saved countless American lives and destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft. The trick that turned Japanese air supremacy upside down wasn't really a trick at all. It was a systematic approach to aerial combat based on using advantages rather than accepting disadvantages. It was refusing to fight the enemy's fight and instead imposing your own terms of engagement. It was the application of intelligence, discipline, and courage to achieve victory. This approach, this way of thinking about combat, was the P-38's greatest legacy. Long after the last Lightning was retired from service, the principles it demonstrated remained relevant. Fight smart. Use your advantages. Control the engagement. These lessons, learned in the skies over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, became fundamental principles of aerial warfare. And it all started with a simple observation. The Zero could outturn the P-38, but the P-38 was faster. Instead of trying to win a turning fight they couldn't win, P-38 pilots learned to fight a different kind of battle, one they could win. That insight and the tactics that flowed from it changed the course of the Pacific War and influenced fighter combat for generations to come. The P-38 Lightning proved that in warfare, as in so much of life, it's not just about what tools you have, it's about how you use them, and American pilots, fighting in the vast expanse of the Pacific, learned to use the Lightning better than anyone thought possible. They turned a challenging aircraft into a war winner. They developed tactics that are still studied today. They helped win the war in the Pacific. That is the true story of the P-38 trick that turned Japanese air supremacy upside down.